This is first Sunday, isn't it? I just thought I'd break the ice here. Michael may arrive. I've not heard that he's not coming, and I would like to know if anybody has heard.
I have not heard, but I did hear that Tara Sullivan is not feeling well, and Zilpa went to take her to the hospital today, so this could be delaying.
She, under her
Michael's
own
arrival.
cognizance, she just recognized there was something going on that she needed immediate attention with. So Zoka, just before we got here, really, so Michael may be involved in that process.
All right, good. He may be, but he's also involved. He just walked in the door.
He just walked in the door. Voila.
So first of all, good morning to all of you. Had just a little emergency this morning. My wife had to go to the hospital. Not life-threatening. So I'm sure Tara will appreciate your prayers, as I also will. Today is our all-day sit, as is our standard on the first Sunday of the month. So for those of you who are not familiar with the program on the first Sunday, we have 3 periods of meditation now with breaks. leading up to lunch. And it's our standard also that during the breaks on the morning sessions, we observe silence up until the lunch break. And then following lunch in the afternoon at 1:30, we come back together and we have a open conversation about the Dharma in general and the practices that we will engage in this morning in particular. Today our practice is the practice of calm abiding. But I thought to raise also a few things around the way that we begin our practice, which is that we first turn our minds away from all of our worldly concerns, all of our worldly refuges, the things that we rely upon in this life, and we exchange those worldly refuges for refuge in our own inherent awakened mind, which we'll come back to in a moment. And in the teachings which describe and prescribe the path by which we come to recognize that awakened mind. And the supports for that path, that practice, that recognition, the exalted Sangha or community of practitioners who we recognize as having accomplished the Dharma. So they become for us, hopefully, an authentic support. So just take a moment here before we recite the liturgy together. It says, until the summit of enlightenment is reached, until the summit of enlightenment is reached. It's an interesting phrase because mostly we have no idea what it means. What is that enlightenment? And one of the ways we can think about it, which is just kind of conceptual mostly, is that inherent awakened nature at its core as the ground of our being, that awakened mind which is not confused, not thoroughly addicted to distraction. An open heart which knows no boundaries. So contemplating these things is helpful, of course. But also, of course, we must come to recognize directly that awakened mind in our own being. Another way that we develop a relationship to that awakened mind, that enlightenment, is to meet great teachers who have accomplished the Dharma and who we can have some experience of their unusual way of being. And through listening to their teachings, their unusual manifestation of wisdom, and that is also helpful. So continuing with the opening prayer, until the summit of enlightenment is reached, till I've made that recognition, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. So we've just talked about the sources of true refuge. But what do we mean by I and all beings? So let's begin with the idea of I and all beings. We begin with the practice and the experience of compassion. And sometimes, I think maybe most of the time, we think of compassion as a nice thing to do. It helps our social interactions. And there's certainly plenty of suffering in the world to feel like giving rise to compassion is a worthwhile goodness. But in the context of aspiring to recognize the nature of mind itself, compassion is the very foundation of that path. The great teacher Trungpa Rinpoche has said, we all understand that without that compassion, we really do not have a path in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. So it's more than just a nice enhancement, though of course it's that. Trungpa Rinpoche goes on to say some interesting things about what he calls the dangers of partial compassion. Well, we all suffer from the dangers of partial compassion. And what he's referencing is our inclination as ordinary beings to give rise to really strong compassion for those individuals we have close connection to, our family, sometimes, our friends, on occasion, but not everyone. Those who we feel have harmed us, we find it difficult to give rise to compassion for them. Those who seem to us to be the perpetrators of great damage in the world, we feel it difficult to have compassion for them. And no matter how far we extend this, we can see that still, when we talk about all beings, we still are working with a small, tiny fraction. So Trungpa Rinpoche goes on to explain, I think very clearly, partial compassion can actually undermine your path. Because when we feel compassion for some but not for others, we leave open almost an invitation to hold negative wishes about those for whom we don't feel compassion. If they suffer, we may think they deserve to suffer. And we ourselves may even engage in perpetrating that suffering under the rationalization that they apparently deserve to have that suffering. So when we think of all sentient beings, there is a functional, practical side to that, imagining all sentient beings coming to practice by virtue of their connection with you as the practitioner. It's not just wanting to be altruistic, to be kind to all beings, which is important to wish that, but it has a functional side, which is very important, undermining our inclination to think that partial compassion is actually sufficient when it's kind of like a boat out in the ocean and it has a leak, but you think it's not a very big leak. Certainly we won't sink for a few days. So in the same way, holding negative views about individuals, and especially feeling like at least my compassion is better than nothing, actually in a certain way, if you look, you can see it's not better than nothing. It might be better to have nothing sometimes, rather than leave the doors open to negative relationships with others and negative wishes. So it's a very kind of functional thing when we say all sentient beings until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. And we are meant to imagine that in front of us all sentient beings gather by virtue of their connection to us. They gather because they are afraid, because they desire freedom from their own confusion, their own mental illness, if you will. And we make this aspiration and this visualization partly because we have a sense of its fundamental goodness, but we need to also understand that this is the heart of the Mahayana. So the question arises, how do we cultivate that compassion? The way we cultivate that compassion, well, there's many ways, but one of the most often taught ways is to think about all the various realms of varying experience in this world, where people we know and don't know wander, sometimes hungry, sometimes violent, bestowing violence on others and having it bestowed upon ourselves. When we see people, not just thinking about them, but when we see people who do not have enough to eat or enough clothing, they appear a little crazy, a little crazed. The only important response is to plant the seeds of compassion. And of course, when we plant those seeds regularly, there's a natural development of the wish that we might be able to do something about it, not just think about it. But most of the things that we do for others in this life are helpful only in the short run. Even if we feed people and clothe people, and even if we cure their illnesses, it's all very temporary. Thinking about how difficult it is to provide genuine, stable help for others, we more and more feel that we must do what's necessary in order to accomplish that. So we can see, I can see, you can see. This is how we nurture compassion in our stream of consciousness, and not just for those individuals we like and appreciate, but for all sentient beings. One of the great evidences of this is when we meet great teachers. Most of the people in this room have met great teachers. if you work at holding compassion for all beings, you definitely come to recognize how difficult it is. It's easy to think they don't deserve it. When we meet great beings, we see that they have a sense of equanimity in relationship to all beings. Sometimes, most importantly, for those who appear to deserve it the least. So I take that, having met some great beings, the old Kala Rinpoche and Boka Rinpoche, and having spent some time with His Holiness Dalai Lama, the previous Karmapa, one of the hallmarks of their appearance is that they never seem to be separated from their compassion for other beings. It's just always there. They never divide the world into perpetrators and victims. If you're confused and unenlightened, you're a victim. So what more do you need to know? So, as we begin today's session, having witnessed in my own mind a certain sense of the ritual of giving rise to bodhicitta, what we call giving rise to the awakened mind, as a kind of mere ritual. You recite the words for refuge, you recite the words for holding the welfare of others in your mind. Then we move on to the next practice. It's kind of like you're walking up the steps. They don't really have any meaning. You just like step this one and then you take the next step and then you're on the porch and then you go to the door and it's like then you're inside. And it seemed maybe we needed to really think about how important compassion and the aspiration to benefit all sentient beings without exception, how critical, how important it is to our path, not just to be good people, good citizens, but critical to our path. So when Trungpa Rinpoche said it's dangerous, partial compassion, he's not actually talking about dangerous in a worldly sense. Partial compassion is great in a worldly sense, better some than none. But from a deep spiritual perspective, better some than none doesn't work. You really need to imagine all sentient beings and think about the kinds of suffering that are in the world and how difficult many beings have, how much difficulty they have with their own personal suffering. So we often say, good to include others in your meditation practice, to imagine them there and practicing with you. So now I'm feeling a little bit like it's not good to include others in your practice. It's a requirement. Like you should never sit down to practice without that. There is reason why we always say that aspiring for the awakened mind in order to benefit all sentient beings is the heart of the path, you have to treat it as not just a ritual, but as really the heart of the path. Like the gas in the car or the wheels that it rides on. These things are not just rituals. You have to actually embrace them as the very thing that you are doing. So we will begin by reciting the refuge prayer 3 times together and bodhicitta 3 times together, and let your mind kind of settle into the meaning and the importance of this. That is not just frosting on the cake, it's the cake.
Until
The summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Generally, in our meditation practices, from the Mahayana perspective, we divide our practices into 2 broad categories: the practice of calm abiding and the practice of insight. Our subject this morning then, and for most of today, is the practice of calm abiding. Calm abiding has one really big advantage over so many other practices, in that the instructions for doing it are easy to understand. That's not always the case in this tradition. And calm abiding is also, while easy to understand, it is also, one could say, the most important practice we have. Calm abiding is about developing the skill, learning how to allow the mind to relax, still, free of excess distraction. So I like that word excess. That means I can have little distraction, a little compassion. It's another word that the translator for Trungpa Rinpoche used, excess distraction. Sort of catches you in a way. Is there not an excess? Isn't any distraction an excess? Usually we might say any distraction is an excess. Good to have none. But distraction is not the main problem here. Like in so many areas of our life, where we are tired of doing something and we wish we would or could or even wanted to do something else, the issue is habit. So if you want to be slightly more blunt, we might say the issue is addiction. Now this addiction is much bigger than any drug you could be addicted to. The addiction of distraction. The real issue is we love distraction. What could be worse than sitting still? The mind still? What good's that? And not only that, my legs hurt. The distraction is a little break from pain in the legs, pain in the back, painful memories, painful projections. I want to be free of that. Happy to have a distraction. But this is a mistake. Our big job is to overcome our addiction to distraction. In order to overcome our addiction to distraction, of course, because it is such a deep habit, is there a deeper one? I don't know it. I'm intimate with the addiction to distraction. I don't even care what the distraction is. Just give me anything. So our real issue here in calm abiding then is this habit. Now in order to overcome this habit, we have to first investigate it. If our distraction is strong enough, we can sit still for hours. A little pain, no problem. And when it's done, we can feel a sense of accomplishment, which is okay. It's a first step. But more important is that we notice the distraction. Really, I think a case could be made that if distraction were a person, some of you might say it is, but let's just say it's not. But if it were, the worst thing you could do for a distraction is to see it and ignore it. Just see it. And don't take your eye off of it, because it has a habit of undermining your compassion, undermining your discipline, undermining even your willingness to sit still. So as a starting point, I think sort of in the sense that if you want to swim, you're going to have to get wet. We could start with this difficult practice, but easy to understand. I'll just take a moment to outline the cycle as clear as possible, and then you see if you can do it and how to go through this cycle over and over again. We begin having turned our minds from refuge in worldly things having at least the intention to invite all sentient beings to join us in abandoning the causes of suffering, embracing the causes of joy and happiness. That's an easy invitation. We imagine all those beings in front of us arriving because, hey, sounds good. So as we bring our awareness first to our breath as a stepping in point, enter the practice through your breath by just bringing your awareness to the act of breathing. Settle there, aware of the movement of the breath. No commentary necessary. No distraction is necessary. And imagine that by virtue of our intention to benefit all beings, that these beings extending to the very limits of space, as we turn our minds to our breath, they also turn their minds to their breath. We can feel almost a need to be distracted. A kind of pressure which tells us how powerful the addiction to distraction is. So over and over we reiterate to ourselves, reestablish our intention, relax, settle the mind on the breath. Imagine every one of these sentient beings does this. From time to time, unless you are very good at this, you will be distracted. Then you recognize you've been distracted, and then the really hard part comes. We like the distraction. We want it to be the good thing, not the bad thing. But it's okay, you can have the good thing. The good thing is to see the distraction. When you see the distraction, for at least a few moments, there's nothing to do but just gaze at it. Or gaze at the experience if it's an emotion. And gradually, like a horse that's a little wild and has pulled itself away from the tether, you coax yourself back to the breath. If you had to hold your breath, you would do it quicker. Coax yourself back. Bring the mind to the breath. Settle again. And this cycle of bringing the mind to the breath and settling, and then discovering the distraction, and then gently coaxing the mind back. The horse does not want to be forced, doesn't like to be forced. But if it's coaxed gently back, little by little, it will develop the habit of coming back effortlessly. Train it with kindness. And continue like that for just a few moments, and then we'll take a short break.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Lama
and establish all
beings without exception in this state.
So we're going to take a silent break. Probably need 15 minutes or so. So there's bathrooms upstairs and downstairs here, and also in the back of the kitchen. And in the kitchen also there are things to make a cup of tea with if you'd like. So we'll ring the bell in 10 or 15 minutes to come back.